Content warning. This story contains depictions of child neglect and emotional abuse. Reader discretion is advised. She screamed small and sharp against the concrete. "I can't swim." The words folded over themselves in the heat like a cloth thrown into a pool. A thin dress ballooned around the child as a hand, calm and deliberate, gave one last push. The splash was not dramatic. It was ordinary and terrible. The whisper of fabric, a tiny head disappearing, the surface closing above it, as if it had never been broken. For a long instant the water looked like glass. Then Roberto was there. He had been 2 streets away, his car still tucked in a motorcade of black and grey, a call on his phone about a board meeting half-finished in his hand. The villa's gate was a portrait of cultivated calm, hedges clipped to geometric perfection, marble reflecting the noon sun. Inside, everything was curated, the scent of a floral diffuser, a piano that had not been played in months, a hallway of portraits staged to show the right kind of family. The pool, however, had teeth. Roberto did not think. Fury took the place of time. He threw himself over the tiles. Water closed around him, cold and chemical on his face. His wristwatch, an inheritance he wore more for the weight and the meaning than for the hours, slapped water and light, and then stopped, caught on a strap as he climbed out with the child shaking against him. He could feel the small shoulders trembling like a bird. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. Her eyes were wide, and the pupils so big they claimed the rest of her face. He did not notice at first that she was thinner than a child should be. He did not see the small ribs under skin that had been smoothed in family photos. He only heard the small stammer of breath and the single word she kept repeating, "I can't swim, I can't swim." It was not just the pool. It was a statement about everything. Veronica moved the way she had been taught to move in public, a slow, polished grace that looked like kindness. She knelt beside them and, in a voice that belonged in an interview, said, "Thank God you're home. I called for help." Her hand rested for a fraction too long on Roberto's forearm before she sat back, measured and composed. There was no urgency in her face, no remorse in the soft line of her mouth. The villa's staff closed in like a quietly practiced machine. Someone handed a towel. Someone called a doctor. Someone rinsed the marble and set a chaise with an immaculate stack of towels. Roberto held Sophia, the child whose name had been spoken almost reverently in press pieces, the adopted daughter he had promised the world to. In the bathroom, under the glare of a hospital-grade lamp, a pediatrician's face lost its distance. Dr. Juliana Ferreira had seen underfed children before. She had not seen this one in this house. She asked questions that were supposed to be routine and simple. When did this happen? How often? She pressed and listened and wrote in thin, methodical script. The answers did not add up. The bruises were the kind that the sun could not explain away. The marks on Sophia's arms were smudged, as if someone had held her until she stopped asking questions. Dr. Juliana examined the child's belly and counted little hollows where fullness should be. She ordered blood tests, a nutrition panel, a scan. She took pictures as documentation. Those photographs would later be files with a case number, each pixel a witness. She leaned in close and then straightened and said the thing no parent wants to hear. There are signs of chronic neglect. There was a time when Roberto would have believed what the surface told him. The staged dinners, the perfectly posed birthday cakes, Veronica's smile in magazine spreads. He had been slow in some ways and fast in others, fast to trust the façade, slower to see what lay behind the locked doors. He had been busy grieving a woman he had lost. His late wife's death had narrowed the world for him into schedules and obligations, and in that narrowed world, Veronica had fit like a solution. She wore his wife's jewelry with a strange ease and filled empty corners with a taste that matched his. To many, she had become the replacement he needed. To Sophia, she had been something else entirely. That afternoon in the sterile hospital room, guilt arrived as a physical pain. a tightness under the ribs that felt suspiciously like stomachache, and, in Roberto's case, like the particular ache of a man who had measured his time by a watch face and found too many hours unexamined. He thought of the portrait hallway and the locked nursery door he had passed 100 times without opening. He thought of the small sundress he had noticed on a guest room chair last month and had assumed it belonged to a child's playtime. He thought of the times Sophia had watched him from the doorway as he left for meetings, an expression too solemn for a 7-year-old. Outside the ICU-scented warmth of the emergency, Dr. Marina Costa and Dr. Beatriz Santos, social workers from the Municipal Child Protection Service, arrived with firm shoes and softer eyes. They wore paperwork like armor. They asked precise questions, the kind that make adults fidget because the answers admit more than memory. They admit culpability. They also carried a folder thick with procedure. They needed to know who had had access to Sophia, who cooked her meals, who controlled the girl's room, and when. They asked about locks, because locks are the kind of detail that reveals whether a child is permitted to be seen. Veronica provided a portrait version of the evening, a lapse of supervision, a child's sudden clumsiness. She spoke of falling and fright and the family's deep love. Her tone suggested a single terrifying moment of misfortune, but the social workers had been trained to listen to what a narrative leaves out. When Marina asked to see Sophia's bedroom, Veronica's smile tightened. "It's a private room," she said, "for her privacy." The phrase landed like a shield. Roberto noticed then that the door to the child's room had a new lock, one he had not authorized. There were codes in the home automation system that he had never been given. The lock was a small click of metal. It opened with a key that did not belong to him. "You mean to tell me," Roberto began, and his voice did something he hadn't expected. It broke. He had money that could fix anything. He had lawyers and private hospitals and security systems that scanned faces, but money had been no substitute for noticing. The social workers took the brokenness calmly. They explained protocol, mandatory reporting, an immediate investigation, the need for documentation. They asked for consent to take Sophia to a pediatric hospital for further tests. Roberto signed forms with hands that shook. He asked himself, for the first time with full awareness, how long the child had lived in a house that looked like a museum and felt like a cage. On the walk back to the villa, Roberto's driver, Jorge, lingered at the car. Jorge had been part of the household for years. He had watched comings and goings through rear doors and hedged walks. He said nothing about the pool that day, only that he had seen Sophia left alone at times, standing under the watchful glass of the conservatory as if she were part of a display. "Mistress always says she gives her privacy," Jorge said. "But sometimes privacy is a different thing." Jorge's words would not on their own be a legal case, but they were a stitch in a wider fabric. That evening, the villa's kitchen was quieter than usual. Donna Marta, the cook, moved as if she were invisible. Her hands had fed the household for a decade, had slid dishes across marble counters, as the world inside them maintained an impeccable silence about what it did not want to know. She had seen Sophia's portioned plates arrive on a small tray, barely touched. She had seen bowls return to the sink, barely used. When Dr. Beatriz spoke to her privately, Donna Marta's eyes filled with the kind of shame that comes from serving and seeing harm at the same time. She had fed the wrong things and said nothing because she feared losing her job. It is one thing to be quietly cruel in a mansion. It is another to be publicly accused of cruelty in the same. "I thought I was doing what I was told," she said. "I thought that was the way." Roberto's first call after the morning wash of events was not to his lawyer, but to the man who would become his counsel. Fernando Nogueira, a family lawyer with steady hands and a reputation for discretion. Fernando listened and then said what needed to be said, firm, not fulmination. "We collect everything," he told Roberto, "medical reports, witness statements, automation logs. If there was a lock, we document it. If there was a camera, we retrieve it. If there are people who will speak, we prepare depositions. He outlined steps that read like a checklist for repairing a life with papers. Roberto wanted to express gratitude with cash and appointments, to make everything right with resources. Instead, he found himself answering questions about who had keys and what entries had been logged in the home automation system. There were noises then that sounded different. The house that had been a collection of quiet surfaces was now a scene under scrutiny. Security footage that had looked like decor, screens mounted like artworks, would be subpoenaed. The API logs of a home assistant, all those polite voice commands printed like invisible footprints, would be read. It was astonishing and demoralizing to find that the things designed to protect a household could, in their own way, be evidence that it had not protected the smallest member. Sophia, meanwhile, slept in a hospital bed with a folded blanket that smelled faintly of lemon. The tubes attached to small fingers were not invasive. They were documentation of care that had been absent. She woke sometimes and searched the room for a face that belonged to safety. When Dr. Juliana placed a small pad of paper and a box of crayons at the foot of the bed, Sophia drew at first, without looking up. Her hand moved in patient, practiced arcs, small lines becoming a shape, a whale alone in a wide sea. Later, more drawings would be found crumpled behind furniture, the whale smaller each time, sometimes trapped behind squares that looked like cages. The whale would become a motif, a private code of a child's loneliness that would haunt the case notes of people who had not seen the drawings at first and could not unsee them later. An early decision Roberto made felt less like choice and more like confession. Place the house under investigation and remove the person most likely to harm the child. He confronted Veronica in the living room, the family portraits looking on like a jury. She was, for all her public composure, quick to anger when the cameras were not watching. "This is hysterical," she said, her voice sliding into the controlled indignation she wore for compliments. "You are making a scene. You should trust me." "Trust has to be earned," Roberto said, the words thin and spare. For a man who had spent his life buying solutions, saying that felt like a bankruptcy. He ordered a temporary removal. Security would escort Veronica from the premises. The move was surgical and messy, like removing a jewel from a setting. It left a cold shape in the space where she had been. She left composed, a small case of jewelry discreetly packed, eyes flint glass, steady. Outside the gate, a car waited. Her lawyer's phone call had been ready. The talk of privacy and patients' rights, of defamation and the wreckage of reputation would begin. For a few days the narrative was private and tender. Roberto stayed in the hospital room more than in his boardrooms. He learned the slow routines of a child who had been neglected, coaxing food, reading in a low voice, watching cartoons together at an unhurried pace. Sophia's trust did not return like a light switch. She did not hug him at first. She sat a hand's length away on the edge of the bed, fingers drumming the sheets, watching him watch. When he brought a watch to the bedside, his own stopped watch, now dented and forever tied to the moment, she took it between her small palms and said nothing. To him the watch had become heavy with meaning. He wore it no longer. News, as it is wont to do, crept in through channels Roberto had thought impermeable. Someone photographed the ambulance leaving the villa. Someone called a tabloid that thrived on the juxtaposition of wealth and scandal. Within hours, the sanitized image of the family started to fray in public view. Veronica's PR team placed a narrative of crisis, a private family moment misinterpreted by an overreaching media. Photographs of Sophia walking into the villa earlier in the week, images meant to prove normalcy, circulated alongside grainy frames of the pool incident. Roberto, who had always feared that his public life could not be reclaimed once it was damaged, found in the public harangue a new purpose. He had resources. He could buy a narrative as he had bought pieces of art, but he knew that what he needed now was the truth documented and made coherent. The first investigative steps were a montage of small, precise actions played out with clinical patience. A technician from the security firm spent long hours crouched by racks of servers in the villa's basement, the place where luxury houses and their secrets sometimes met literally. Discs, logs, the quiet clicking that suggests durability. He pulled a backup drive and found, sometime in the middle of the night, fragments of video. Not all footage had been kept. Some had been overwritten by an automatic loop, but in an emergency log, a 30-second clip survived, a frame of a child's dress, a reflection in water, a hand. It was grainy, it was partial, but it was a start. Forensic technicians would later tell courts that 30 seconds could be decisive. Meanwhile, the minor staff were being interviewed in meetings that felt to them like church confessions. Claudio, the former housekeeper who had left months earlier, agreed to meet with an investigator in a small cafe near the train station. He had been older than most in the household, a man who had tended to bedrooms and secrets with quiet diligence. When he spoke, he was careful with names and dates, but the pattern emerged. Meals withheld for reasons that had been presented as dietary instruction, doors closed at night so that a child could be left alone without witnesses, small punishments that were explained as discipline. "She cried," he said, voice low, "and I thought if I said something, I would be the one to leave." He had left because the house felt like a place with rules that called for silence. Evidence is not only in objects, it is in pattern. The logs from the home's automation system lined up with Claudio's timeline. Access codes had been changed in the months after adoption. Times when the child's bedroom showed no activity overlapped with times when meals were absent. An investigator trained in reading people as well as numbers noticed that the villa's world of ordered luxury had become a system that systematically hid a child's needs. This would not be, he understood, a case of one moment. It was a case built from accumulation. There were fights over how to handle the narrative externally. Fernando wanted to move carefully, to gather sworn statements, and to consolidate the case before any public release. Veronica's counsel, already a whisper in the background, prepared to counter with accusations of overreach and fractured family relations. Roberto, new to having to be both a father and a man with public obligations, found himself balancing boardroom commitments with hospital rooms. He cancelled meetings, he delegated power, he learned to arrive at a child's bedside and to be present there without a speech prepared. At night, between the interviews and the paperwork, Roberto found himself sitting with a stack of Sophia's drawings he had pried from behind cushions and hidden places. They were small, undone in felt tip and crayon. The whale reappeared more times than not, alone on a sheet, caged on another, some marked with tiny crosses, others with the ocean filled in as a dark, impersonal wash. He saw in those drawings a map of a child's interior, a lexicon of fear. On one sheet, a whale had a small smudge of red near its mouth. Roberto tried not to imagine how it had been intended. He placed the drawings in a folder labeled Exhibit A because Fernando said labels mattered in court. Still, at the end of the day, they were drawings of a child who wanted to be seen. Not everyone in the house took the turn to investigation as an admission of wrongdoing. Some saw it as a crisis, an inconvenience to be managed. The PR team spun messages. Veronica, in interviews conducted through carefully prepared statements, described herself as a mother wronged by a panicked partner and a media quick to assume harm. Her narrative would be the kind that needed to be rebutted by records. Roberto understood that the courtroom was not only a place for facts, but also for reputations. He also felt, with a physical clarity, that money and public statements would not stitch the hole in a child's safety. The first formal hearing to determine immediate custody measures was scheduled within days. A judge, an emblematic figure who liked protocol and the measured rhythm of a gavel, would decide whether Sofia should remain under Roberto's temporary guardianship or whether other measures were necessary. The hearing would not be a trial of criminal charges, but an emergency decision about what would keep a child safe in the short term. Fernando prepared a packet: the pediatrician's notes, the social worker's initial assessment, witness statements, and the security technician's report about the missing and found video fragments. The legal piece was simple on paper and catastrophic in practice. In order to act, the court would require documentation. Documentation required testimony. Testimony required the courage of people to speak against someone who had been presented to the world as saintly. In private, Roberto rehearsed how to speak in a way that did not sound like a man trying to smother the woman who had worn his home's masks. He did not yet understand in full the nuance of culpability and codependency. What he did know was that a child's frightened whisper in a pool was a fault line too large to ignore. He prepared to testify not only to the facts, but to his guilt, because guilt, or at least the admission of failure, can read to a judge as a basis for change. He had always believed in proof over confession, but now he understood that they were sometimes the same thing. Sofia sat in the corner of the visitor room at the social services office for an intake interview. Dr. Patricia Mendez, a child psychologist, was careful and patient. She used toys as a language children could speak with. She let Sofia choose a figure and then watched what the child did. When Sofia chose a small whale toy and placed it behind a tiny chair, Patricia watched the way her shoulders went in. The child spoke in short sentences, the kind that could not be coaxed into litigation but could be listened to. She closed my door. I was scared. I was hungry. It was not eloquent. It was not detailed. It was what she had. It was enough to begin a case. The narrative that would later dominate op-eds and coffee conversations, the billionaire who had been absent until fury made him fierce, was already taking shape in the quieter rooms of the hospital and the offices where caseworkers logged what they heard and saw. There was a moral complexity to it. Roberto had resources and access that most do not. His absence had been genuine in certain ways, and chosen in others by priorities that were always negotiable. The story did not offer simple villains and heroes, not if one looked beyond the thunder of a rescue. It offered people who had been both blind and willfully myopic. As investigators began to map the villa's interior in diagrams and timelines, a former nanny came forward with a detail that felt small and enormous. She said shyly that Veronica had a box where she kept notes. The nanny described it as an old jewelry box that had been repurposed. Inside, small envelopes, each containing a folded paper with instructions for the staff and lists of rules that sometimes concerned the child's eating schedule, sometimes concerned where the child could be allowed to go. The envelopes were dated, the dates aligned with changes in the child's weight charts. The box, if found, would be a document of intent rather than accident. It would show a pattern of deliberate control. The thought of that box existing chilled Roberto in a way that reports and scans had not. It was not only the physical neglect, it was the regimen of small decisions designed to limit. They found the box tucked behind a secret panel in Veronica's dressing room, where she kept perfume bottles and high-collared blouses. Inside were notes with precise commands, portions of food, timing for bathing, reasons to deny playmates. The handwriting was meticulous. The voice on paper was a commanding whisper. For the lawyers, the box was an artifact that would speak in court. For Roberto, for the first time in months, the old man with the watch felt the pull of paternal outrage, mixed with a sorrow he could not properly name. Not everyone agreed with the direction the case was taking. Some friends advised restraint. Others, with the hunger of people who live on gossip, waited to see which side would dominate. Veronica's supporters hinted that Roberto's grief over his late wife had been exploited by a woman who loved him and had overstepped. Their press lines were ready, polished to deflect the rawness of a child's voice. Meanwhile, Roberto's team coordinated with social services to keep Sophia's environment stable and evidence uncontaminated. At night, after depositions and meetings and the slow administrative march of custody forms, Roberto returned to the folder of drawings. He spread them on a table in the guest house office and saw a small sequence that looked like the arc of a child's heart. The whale at first alone, then behind bars, then on the last sheet he had found before the drawers were sealed for court. A whale with a friend beside it, swimming in a sea that had been colored in soft blue. He kept that sheet for himself, folded it in the inside pocket of a suit he wore only to the hospital now. Then came the call that would change the tempo of everything. The security technician found a backup, and the backup contained a clip that had not been overwritten. The file was corrupted in pieces. It needed work. They could not promise that it would yield the image anyone wanted. When the technician finally called, his voice was thin with fatigue and with something like relief. "We have something," he said, "but it's not everything. It's 30 seconds. It's the pool." Roberto stood in the villa's kitchen with the folder of drawings under his arm, and for the first time the watch in his hand felt like an instrument of time, measure, and responsibility. Fernando told him to breathe and to prepare. The 30 seconds might show nothing more than a body in water. It might show the hand which had pushed. It might be ambiguous enough to be argued into meaninglessness. Yet the clip was a hinge. It could be the thing that made a private disaster visible to the law. It could be the seed of a case that might finally require the truth to be met with consequence. Roberto called Sophia into the room that evening, and she came with the slowness of someone not sure whether she was allowed to enter other people's spaces. He did not show her the video. He did not need to. Instead, he put the last whale drawing on the table and held out his hand. She eyed the paper, and then, after a small, invisible negotiation, the child reached forward and placed her small hand in his. Her fingers fit within his in the way that small hands illustrate the size of later promises. He did not know how to be a father yet. He only knew how to be present. They were, as the investigators began to say in private, at a point of accumulation. Materials were being gathered, medical reports, automation logs, witness statements, a fragment of video, a box of notes. Each item was a thread. Each thread could be woven into a story that held someone accountable, or could be frayed apart by lawyers and spin. In the villa's guest house, as night fell and pool lights painted mosaics on marble, Roberto sat with the watch in his palm, the whale drawing between his knees, and listened to the far hum of the servers in the basement like a sleeping animal. He had arrived furious at a pool and left with something more dangerous and rarer than anger, the realization that he had to change everything he had not known how to guard. The world had watched him as a wealthy man. Now, because of a child's small cry, he had become a man whose entire public life might be recast around a private failing. That, he thought, might be the only honest way out. If you believe in protecting children, tap like and tell us where you're watching from. The next morning, the villa felt like a house under glass. There were moments of routine curated into a normality that no longer convinced. A legal team arrived early with boxes of evidence and a surgical calm. Social workers took Sophia to meet with a pediatric nutritionist who would chart months of weight gain and therapy appointments. Fernando and Roberto sat for hours in a study that had sounded many business plans. Now they planned interviews and depositions. Security technicians sent technicians into server rooms. Claudio was flown home from a small town with promises of protection for his testimony. Donna Marta brought a small lunch and left it untouched, as if food had become a thing too public for private sorrow. There was one more file to be found, something no one had thought to check until an archivist suggested the obvious: old backup tapes from a third-party contractor who had serviced the villa's cameras. The company had changed providers once before, and someone had failed to migrate a folder. It was an error of business, a mistake of neglect, but sometimes neglect gives way to clarity. When the contractor's hard drive was opened in a sterile office downtown, it revealed more than a technical lapse. It showed, on a jumpy, grainy feed, a frame of the pool edge with the small dress in the seconds before the child's fall. It showed a hand, shadowed and quick. It did not reveal all the intention of a human heart, but it did show an act that would not be easy to explain away. Roberto watched the clip in the company of his lawyer and the technicians. The image was brief: a child's dress, a hand, water. The clip would have to be authenticated. It would have to be chained with testimony that put it in context. It would be cross-examined, and its meaning would be debated in courtrooms and op-ed columns alike. Still, when the hand appeared on the screen, something inside Roberto changed irreversibly. He felt the cold hush of someone who had passed a threshold into a new kind of responsibility. When he later replayed the seconds at home, alone, he noticed how the watch in his jacket pocket vibrated against his ribs, as if to remind him that time would not return what had been lost. He would later, in interviews and in statements to courts, admit to culpability, less in the sense of active abuse than in the sense of having been absent in a way that allowed harm. That confession would be pored over and parsed, used as evidence of contrition or as a talking point by critics. But in that first week, confession was private, practical, and immediate. He hired a child psychologist, he changed the locks he had earlier ignored, he set a new rhythm for the house that centered around one small person rather than around his schedule. He did not know if those actions would undo the past. He knew only that doing nothing would be an act he could not bear. The investigation had begun as a rescue at a pool, and had unspooled into a much longer attempt to map how invisible harm can hide under marble and perfume. People who loved the illusion of that household would either defend it fiercely or be forced to reckon with their complicity. For the staff, the case posed moral decisions about loyalty and safety. For the lawyers, it posed issues of strategy and the management of image. For Roberto, it posed the question: could a life built on transactions be rebuilt on attention? The doorbell chimed with the thinness of a world that no longer welcomed ignorance. Fernando placed his hand over the folder on the table and said softly, "We must move quickly. Statements, sworn depositions, protect the child, validate the video, prepare for a media counterattack." Roberto listened. He had money to hire teams, but money could not make a child suddenly trust. It could, however, keep her safe from further immediate harm. He would learn to accept that the work of being a father was not a product to be purchased, but an ongoing labor. Outside, the ocean was a suggestion of a horizon that might one day contain other meanings for Sophia than fear. Inside, the whale drawings were now evidence and memory and promise. Roberto placed the most recent one in an album with the hospital's documentation and walked the villa as a man who had been awakened. He closed doors he had opened carelessly, he read reports, and he learned to listen to a small voice that had been crying for attention beneath the lacquer of a perfect life. The investigation was only beginning. The pieces were in motion: the video, the box with instructions, the testimonies of staff, the social worker's classification of chronic neglect, the doctor's report, and the child's simple sentences. In court, all of these would need to be assembled into a persuasive account that could alter custody and set the course for criminal proceedings. In the rooms where decisions would be made, people were taking sides, and the calm of the villa had been surrendered to the incision of scrutiny. When Roberto finally stood outside by the pool that had begun everything, the surface reflected his face and the remembrance of a child's small, repeated plea. He put his palm on the water as if to feel its temperature, the way someone touches a wound to confirm it is real. The marble felt cold beneath his shoes. The watch in his pocket ticked on, indifferent, and in its rhythm he felt the steady, stubborn fact of time moving forward, whether he was ready or not. The next step, the judge would say when the hearing began, was to ensure the child's safety while due process continued. But beyond the legalese lay a more delicate work, teaching a child that the world could be both dangerous and trustworthy, that a father could be fallible and still shelter, that a whale could swim away from loneliness. That was a lesson that would take years, not headlines. For now, there was only the slow, precise filing of evidence and the careful human work of being present to a child who had once been invisible. The next weeks moved like a careful, exhausting choreography. Papers multiplied. Witnesses were shepherded into rooms with neutral chairs and bland water bottles. Fernando insisted on sequence and chain. Who touched what and when, who logged into the home system and who had physical keys. The security technician, an unremarkable man named Leandro, who preferred numbers to cameras, explained in a calm voice that nevertheless suggested something like moral force, how he had preserved the backup and created an unbroken chain of custody. He testified to the steps of authentication: original drive, duplicate, hash codes, sealed envelopes. It was technical and it was necessary. In court, small facts often carry large weight. The prosecutor assigned to the case, a woman with a clear tone and purposeful eyes, opened the public hearing like a well-crafted map. She did not shout, she did not perform. She laid out evidence in the quiet, inexorable manner of someone who has worked many cases and knows how to make one thing lead to another. The medical reports were read aloud. The nutritionist described months of weight loss inconsistent with normal pediatric growth. Blood panels showed deficiencies. Scars had been photographed and catalogued. Dr. Juliana spoke calmly about the physical evidence of prolonged neglect, and Dr. Patricia described, without melodrama, the psychological markers she had observed in a 7-year-old whose world had once been tightly policed. On the stand, Claudio, the former housekeeper, answered in a voice that sometimes trembled. He told of nights when a child's cries had been muffled by halls, and voices had told him those sounds were private. He described trays returned untouched and rules that appeared in a small box of notes. The judge, Paulo Henrique Silveira, who liked to keep his courtroom orderly and whose gestures were spare, listened as if each testimony were a tile being set into a mosaic. Donna Marta, the household cook, who had once kept her head down for fear of losing a job she had loved, spoke about the portions she had been instructed to prepare and the way she had watched a child pick at food without saying anything. Jorge, the driver, described the way a child watched from windows as the rest of the house moved the world as if she were not in it. Veronica's counsel paced the counter-argument with practiced ease. He asked about timing and suggested alternative explanations. He emphasized privacy, characterizing certain restrictions as protective rather than punitive. He questioned witnesses with the kind of cool that can make memories waver. The public gallery became a place of shifting sympathies. Some watching with a hunger for moral clarity, others waiting for an explanation that would let them return to their comfortable assumptions. Then the video was played. It was short and grainy, the kind of image that in better lighting would be ordinary. Sunlight cutting the pool in ribbons, a child's dress caught in motion, a hand in the frame. The court technicians slowed frames and adjusted contrast. Experts explained what the human eye could not always make sense of in 30 shaky seconds. To a few in the room, it looked like nothing more than a misstep. To others, the motion of the hand and the angle of the push carried a meaning that needed to be weighed alongside the pattern already described by doctors and staff. Authentication took hours on paper and minutes in perception. The defense would later attempt to argue ambiguity. The prosecution insisted on context. Sophia did not have to watch the footage. At 7, it would have been too much. Instead, her small voice, the voice that had been heard at the pool and then in hospital wards and therapy rooms, was put to the stand with care. Dr. Patricia and a court official framed the questions in gentle, age-appropriate language. The child's testimony was not cinematic. There was no extended unraveling of events. When asked simply what she remembered, Sophia said in short, measured sentences that came like stone from a well. "I was by the pool. I cried. She pushed me. I couldn't get up. The door was closed. I didn't eat sometimes." There were no flourishes and no theatrical details. It was a child's truth, spare, direct, and devastating in its clarity. Jurors are often told to separate emotion from fact, but emotion is data in its own way. The judge took time, more time than the cameras or the tabloids might have preferred, to question witnesses in the rhythm of a man who had lived with law as a craft. Slow, exact, attentive. Medical experts explained how chronic malnutrition looks, not only at the bedside, but on charts and blood work. Nutritionists laid out the expected growth curves and what deviation over months implies. Psychologists elaborated on avoidance behaviors, on how a child's fear of water or closed doors can be not a quirky trait, but a learned survival strategy. The housekeeper's notes and the jewelry box of instructions were catalogued and entered into evidence. The automation logs showed entries where codes had been changed and doors had been reported as secured at odd hours. Together, those pieces formed a pattern, not a single case of misfortune, but a program of containment. Outside the courtroom, the media noise shifted into a chorus. There were commentaries about privilege and accountability. There were op-eds about the difficulty of policing private homes. Veronica's camp put out statements about misunderstanding and private discipline gone wrong. She spoke through a spokesperson who used carefully measured phrases about love and remorse without saying the words the evidence sought to prove. Supporters rallied in corners of social media, some denouncing Roberto as a man who only acted when scandal threatened his image. Others praised his decisive actions. The push and pull of sympathy and doubt would be a feature of public life for months to come. Inside the court, one of the more decisive moments came when the security technician explained how the backup had survived an automatic overwrite, a misconfigured migration at a third-party contractor that had accidentally preserved a fragment of footage. When Leandro, the technician, showed the metadata and the sealed chain of custody envelopes, there was a movement in the courtroom that was not dramatic but precise. A file had been authenticated, an object that could be traced from camera to server to court clerk. Evidence of this kind is industrial and therefore persuasive. The defense challenged it, calling into question timestamps and potential tampering, but the technician's meticulous documentation and the independent analyst's corroboration blunted those attacks. When the judge rendered his interim decision about custody, it was not a dramatic pronouncement so much as a firm, administratively clear ruling. For the child's safety, immediate temporary custody would remain with Roberto. Veronica was to have no contact pending further proceedings. A restraining order was issued. The judge also instructed prosecutors to pursue a criminal inquiry into alleged neglect and endangerment. The language on the bench was precise. The court found sufficient evidence to remove immediate risk, and it directed that criminal investigation proceed without delay. The ruling did not declare guilt. It ordered protection. There were practical consequences to the ruling. Social services worked to secure long-term therapy plans, to place additional safeguards in the villa now functioning as a child's home, to design a schedule that would introduce predictability into Sophia's days. Roberto, who had spent years negotiating with executives and investors, began to negotiate presence. He learned to say no to meetings without rehearsing his defense. He traded a portion of his public calendar for the ritual of morning milk, for reading at a small kitchen table, for a trip to a public pool where he and Sophia could sit on the shallow bench and watch other children play while she learned that water could be safe. Therapy was neither linear nor fast. Dr. Patricia described the process in patient, practical terms. First stabilization, then the slow work of trust building, then exposure in controlled steps to things that had previously been frightening. Play therapy sessions involved puppets, water play in small tubs, games that let Sophia name feelings and then put them down. She learned to place a toy whale in a cup of water and watch it float over and over until the motion lost its threat. In group therapy, with children who had also known fear in homes, Sophia encountered other small bodies of resilience. Those other children did not erase what had happened. They offered company in its aftermath. Roberto's own re-education was less professional and more instinctive. He learned to sit without fixing. He learned to ask rather than dictate. He attended sessions where his faults were not excused but illuminated, an absence of presence that had allowed patterns to calcify. In the therapy room, he listened to stories of a child who had invented rules to survive, and he practiced being a partner to someone learning new rules. He kept his watch, but not on his wrist. It lay on a bedside table, a small object he could hand to Sophia when she asked for it, a relic tied to the day he had jumped into water and found an entirely different kind of responsibility. The criminal case proceeded in parallel with the custody matter. Prosecutors weighed charges and considered strategy. They charged Veronica with child endangerment and chronic neglect, charges that, once filed, would require evidence, witnesses, and a legal narrative that jurors could accept as beyond reasonable doubt. Veronica pleaded not guilty at first, and the case was set on a path that would test the resilience of the witnesses and the clarity of the evidence. Trials compress human lives into schedules. There were depositions, documents, and the slow grind of pre-trial motions. During those months, character witnesses were called and cross-examined. Friends of Veronica stepped in to suggest alternative explanations. Technical experts debated the reliability of timestamps and camera angles. The defense attempted to reframe the question as one of private discipline and misunderstanding, while the prosecution focused on patterns of behavior and the physical and psychological evidence of chronic harm. At the center of all this was Sophia's life, which had to go on despite subpoenas and court dates. She began to attend a small neighborhood school with a quiet principal who agreed to be a point of contact in case of need. She learned the rhythms of classroom days, of recess, of a teacher who read aloud from books with whales and wide seas. Swimming lessons were introduced slowly. First ankle dips at a public pool with an instructor trained in trauma-informed care, then short periods of sitting on the edge and kicking. Then, eventually, a day when she let the instructor hold her in the shallow water while Roberto watched from the poolside, palms on the rail. When Veronica's defense finally rested and the jury deliberated, the outcome felt like a compressed version of the larger moral conversation that had unfolded around the villa. The jury found her guilty on counts of chronic neglect and child endangerment. The sentence, decided by the judge following deliberation and guidelines, included a custodial sentence suspended in part, mandatory counseling, significant community service related to child welfare education, and a long-term prohibition on contact with Sophia. The criminal sentence was a legal resolution within a narrow scope. It imposed consequences, but it would not magically repair the years of damage. For Roberto, the verdict was relief, but not the end of his work. Court decisions had secured legal safety. They had not yet restored the quiet faith of a child who had learned to protect herself by shrinking. He continued therapy with Sophia and with professionals who advocated for a slow, layered approach to healing. He kept his life less curated and more hospitable to mess. He stopped asking for perfection in the house. Locks were changed, codes centralized, rooms opened to daylight. He took small, symbolic acts as seriously as legal ones. He filled the refrigerator with food a child liked, not food judged by others. He answered the door when she asked for a snack. He read the same book aloud at night until the words were no longer a ritual of performance, but a habit that belonged to them. The public watched these changes unevenly. Some applauded, some criticized, some remained skeptical. The press cycle moved on to other scandals and other stories, but the ripples of the villa's revelations continued in quieter channels. Donations to child protection charities spiked. Activists used the case to push for better oversight of private households, and boards of luxury service companies revised training about reporting. Roberto, painfully aware of the attention that his name brought to causes, decided to convert what had been shame into mechanism. He discussed with his lawyer and with child advocates the idea of creating a foundation that would support children rescued from private neglect and that would train household staff to recognize red flags. He did not name it for himself. The name they chose later, the Blue Harbor Initiative, borrowed the whale motif without sentimentality, a refuge where children could find safety and where caretakers could learn the difficult work of witnessing. The Foundation's first meetings were earnest, messy, and practical. They involved charts, budgets, and conversations about collaboration with municipal agencies. Roberto funded scholarships for trauma-informed care courses for domestic workers, created grants to help families access therapy, and endowed a public awareness campaign about warning signs of child neglect in private homes. He insisted on transparency in governance and on the involvement of survivors in advisory roles. The Foundation's logo was a simple hand-drawn whale, deliberately imperfect like a child's drawing, to remind everyone who saw the seal that protection starts small and humble. While legal processes unfolded and the Foundation began its work, recovery at home moved in small, cumulative victories rather than grand gestures. There were mornings when Sophia asked for cereal and ate it all. There were afternoons when she went to school and came home with a picture of 3 whales swimming together. There were nights when she slept without waking, and other nights when she woke and needed to crawl into Roberto's bed and count watch ticks until sleep returned. The watch that had fallen and stopped at the pool day lived now in a drawer. Its stop time had become a crucible of change rather than a relic to be kept in place. On a bright, windy morning some months after the trial, Roberto took Sophia to the ocean. It was not a cinematic reclaiming of water, but a careful, orchestrated exposure. A public beach where lifeguards watched, and an instructor from the pool program would be on hand. The first contact with sand was tentative. Sophia pressed a foot into the cold. She watched waves arrive and pull back. The instructor had a small inflatable ring. Roberto sat at the edge and let waves lap at his shoes while Sophia stood beside him, the wind bending her hair across her face. He did not push her. He did not speak in platitudes. He offered handholds. They walked into the shallow water together, the pale blue meeting the shore with the persistent softness of months rebuilding trust. After a few minutes of letting the sea move around their ankles, Sophia reached out and without fanfare put her hand on a small, plastic toy whale the instructor had given her. She laughed, a small, surprising sound that felt like a key sliding in a lock. It was not triumphal, it was quiet, a child learning, in increments, that water could be a place of play and not only peril. Roberto looked down and saw her small fingers curl around the toy. He put his hand over hers for a beat and then let it go. The watch in his pocket ticked, ordinary and indifferent. He let it be. The media covered the beach visit with a decorous tenderness, less appetite for scandal now, more curiosity about long-term recovery. Roberto used the attention to announce the Blue Harbor Initiative publicly, inviting people to support trauma-informed programs and training. He insisted the foundation not be a way to launder reputation, but a means to expand what had been learned from a painful mistake. He met survivors and families and listened more than he spoke. He handed over some governance roles to professionals and to people who had lived through abuse and learned to survive. Ears, of course, do much of the work time must do. Sophia's drawings shifted over time. Where once a lone whale sat in a godless expanse, later drawings showed schools, whales side by side, playfully circling, some with small boats above them. Those drawings were pinned to a refrigerator without comment, becoming a quiet record of change, not proof of cure. Therapy notes showed progress and setbacks. There were anniversaries when she would not want to talk about the pool. There were other days when a swimming instructor would call with an excited update about a new stroke she had tried. Roberto learned to measure success in smaller units. An hour of uninterrupted play, a day without nightmares, a conversation where she could name a fear and then choose a strategy to face it. The Blue Harbor Initiative grew into a modest but respected organization. It sponsored training sessions for domestic workers on recognizing and reporting neglect, provided living stipends for witnesses who feared speaking up, and funded mobile therapy teams that could reach children in need. It also supported local policy work meant to improve oversight and reporting standards in private residences. Roberto did not use this as a shield against criticism. He welcomed scrutiny and invited auditors into the foundation. He knew that accountability had to be built into any attempt to repair what privilege had broken. There were moments of strange reconciliation. Donna Marta agreed to be interviewed for a training module about the ethics of service and the duty to protect. Claudio, years later, spoke to new witnesses about the courage of speaking up. Jorge, the driver, received a commendation from a local child protection agency for his testimony in the case, and he used the modest stipend to enroll in a certification program that led him to work advising households on safety protocols. Many of these acts were small, but they became the infrastructure of a different approach to care. Public opinion, as it often does, split between those who believed Roberto had been a noble, if belated, rescuer, and those who thought wealth had allowed him to perform penance on a larger stage. Both perspectives held some truth. He had resources that enabled a rapid, thorough response. He had also been culpable by absence in ways that would not be erased by donations. He spoke about that candidly at a foundation gala, about learning to be humble in the face of a child's needs, about how money cannot buy the daily labor of presence. He acknowledged his failures and framed the foundation as a mechanism to ensure that other children would not rely on chance or public spectacle for protection. Sophia grew. She learned to tie her shoes and to board a school bus. She learned to navigate friendships that had nothing to do with headlines. At home, certain rituals became sacred. Saturday pancakes, the reading of the same whale storybook before bed, and the slow knocking on doors to ask permission to enter, a ritual born of a child who had once been denied the right to be seen. One evening, years after the pool incident, Roberto found a new drawing tucked into a coffee table book. It was a page crowded with whales, playful and various, their bodies skewed in a charming childlike disregard for scale. There was a small figure at the fringe, a girl with a round head and a long smile, standing by the shore. Roberto kept the drawing without comment for a long time. He did not need to say anything. He had watched the arc of small things change. The staff, who were now trained to recognize signs, the boxes of notes replaced by clear policies, the alarm codes centralized and managed transparently. He had given money to programs that helped others and taken no credit for measures he had been late to adopt. When the Foundation released its first annual report, they included a short, careful disclaimer. Some legal procedures have been condensed for storytelling clarity in public materials. Complex cases involve many steps and professionals. The report then listed programs and outcomes, numbers of staff trained, children assisted, therapy hours funded. It was rigorous and public in a way that Roberto had not been in the mornings when he used to try to fix the world with single gestures. The ocean, in the end, became what it had always been, a place of both risk and wonder. It did not erase the past, nor did it require theatrics to prove healing. One late afternoon, with a wind that scattered gull feathers and sunlight that painted the sea like metal, Sophia waded past the waterline, letting the waves whisper around her calves. She carried with her a school project, a drawing of whales, and she walked toward a group of children building a sand fort. She did not shout to be seen. She went because she wanted to be with other children. Roberto watched from a bench a few yards away. He did not hover. He had, over time, learned the difference between rescue and stewardship. At times, he still thought of the watch. He still felt the hollow that opened the day he had plunged into water. But that hollow had become, most of the time, a space where learning lived. He kept the stopped watch in a small box, not as a trophy, but as a reminder, to measure less and to notice more. On the refrigerator at home, among permission slips and school photos, a new drawing kept a small, proud place, a parade of whales, some small, some large, some painted with bright crayons, all moving together. Below the picture, in uneven handwriting, a small caption had been added, one that Sophia insisted on writing herself: "Whales swim together." The sentence was simple and not sentimental. It was a child's statement of a collective truth. Swimming is easier with others beside you. If this story touched something in you, consider learning the warning signs of child neglect or supporting local organizations that protect children. Small actions from many people can make big differences. Note: some legal procedures have been condensed for storytelling clarity.